Well, Sandy, you said you intended to be provocative, and I think you were, and I'm sure you will have triggered some reactions and some comments.
Good.
Let me start out maybe with a very frontal question. You extolled the virtue of the PeruFTA, and you strongly supported it. As I read it, the Colombia FTA is basically the PeruFTA. So my question is, would we be in better shape or worse shape, as you imply, in dealing with the problems you cite in Colombia if that FTA were in place?
The answer is no. Is this working?
Yeah.
Because what we did with the PeruFTA was to insist on changes before we acted. And there was some criticism of that, including from various sources. But it turned out to be right. And Peru made legislative changes and executive decree changes. And essentially, before we acted, before we voted, they not only said they were going to do it, but they did so. So the lesson of Peru, the same was true in starting on environmental issues. Now, with environmental issues, we knew that there could not be simply a change in the law. There had to be changes in practice over time. But when it came to the labor law changes, we did not say we will sign the agreement and then you make them. We said make them and then we will vote. And it worked well. I remember so well going down to Lima and meeting with the president and his saying it was wise that you help bring about the changes in law that needed to be undertaken. And we went out there in an impromptu way. We didn't plan it. Charlie and Allison and I and the president. And he said to the Peruvian people and to the, I think to Latin America and beyond, that this changed agreement, which we had implemented, was a new deal for workers throughout the world. And that's what we've been asking Colombia to do, to change their laws to reflect international practices. And I suggest if anyone has doubts, they should look at the mission, the ILO mission report that came out last month that spells out, and if you want to do so, I'll quote it later on, that said that there were these changes that needed to be made in terms of co-ops, in terms of other laws, for workers to have their basic ILO rights.
So you make basically a leverage argument, and you did extol the advent of the Santos administration and were encouraged by the prospects. What's your prediction? You think that we will be able to work out an agreement with the Santos administration that will permit the Colombia FTA to have the same positive result that you've just enunciated for Peru?
I hope that's the aim of both administrations. And they are now meeting, as I said, and we'll see. I think proof will be in the product.
Okay, let me ask you one or two others on things you did not address, or at least not address very much. One item I think is on the trade agenda this year that you did, or could be on the trade agenda this year that you did not mention, is Russian accession to the World Trade Organization and the required legislation for us, the PNTR legislation that would repeal Jackson-Vanik. You talked about your support for China PNTR a decade ago. You weren't totally happy with the way that had been implemented. What lessons do you draw for Russia, if any, and do you support going ahead with PNTR for Russia as soon as or around the time that it completes its accession negotiations to the WTO?
Well, as you know, the only handle that the Congress has is PNTR. And so that's why we've refused to give it up. I was in favor of exempting Russia from Jackson-Vanik from that portion. Jackson-Vanik was an amendment to a trade agreement. So I thought that Jackson-Vanik could be waived, if you want to put it that way. And we made that suggestion to both the administration and to certain people in Russia. But the administration, no administration, I think, would like the Congress to maintain its role. I hope that isn't true. And as far as Russia was concerned, we were told that they did not want Jackson-Vanik waived separately from accession. So I think it would be helpful for Russia to become part of the WTO, but as was true with China, the problems have to be worked out and necessary language included before they accede. And the problem is, as to certain aspects, they remain, I think, unresolved. For example, IPR remains an issue. Poultry, beef, certain agricultural products remain a problem. And it may be that there's also a problem in the automotive sector. So I'm hopeful that those issues can be worked out this year. Let me just finish by adding, it isn't easy to say, take care of these issues relating to the WTO, and, if I might be frank, to talk about other issues, including human rights issues relating to Russia. I think their handling of those who dissent is unacceptable and very worrisome. So if the direct WTO issues are resolved, I think it will remain problematical that PNTR can be granted, because the way Russia is conducting itself when it comes to the lack of open trials, the lack of fair trials, and impunity. People are being killed there for exercising their basic rights. I think if they continue on this path, it will be difficult. I think in the end, if the economic issues are resolved, the likelihood is that PNTR will be passed. But with a lot of debate and a lot of dissent.
Sandy, let me ask you one more and then we'll open it up. On the WTO, why is there so little interest in the Congress in the Doha Round? You mentioned it at the end of your remarks. You said you'd like to get it back on track. Why has it been subject to such inattention and lack of interest, lack of push? What would it, put it the positive way, what would it take to get you and other members more interested in pursuing the Doha Round and giving the administration a shove to get something going on that front?
Well, some of us are. I think there's been a rather narrow perspective, especially on the part of the House majority. And essentially, what they have focused on are the FTAs, and now with Korea, in my judgment, being addressed by this administration, on Panama and Colombia. I think what the administration needs to do is to have confidence in what it's doing and to follow through on its commitment to work with the new Santos administration to see if these outstanding issues can be resolved. And I think the administration, at the same time, needs to try to convince people within the Congress to also have more serious discussions about Doha and TPP. I'm not quite sure why it is that there isn't a broader vision. I must say, I think it goes back to my basic view that I think some people are somewhat attached to what I think are outdated approaches to trade policy. And somehow I think they feel as to Doha that things will work themselves out, when I don't think they will. I think we're going to have to sit down. There are serious outstanding issues, Doha, both with developing nations, with China, with Brazil, with agriculture, with the industrial sector. Services were essentially neglected for too long. So I'm not entirely sure what it will take, but I think a broader view of the importance of international trade, but doing it right.
For whatever it's worth, Sandy, that's, I think, consistent with the view we've taken here at the Institute. My colleagues, Jeff Schad, Gary Huffbauer, have done extensive analyses of the payoff to the U.S. from the Doha package that's now on the table, and it's just very small. And as you said, you need to think bigger, have a broader vision, bring services in a major way, up the ante so as to make the whole deal more worthwhile. That's kind of the tack we've taken and the approach that we think would be necessary to generate interest in the business community and the Congress. But it's, I think, consistent with what you say, to have a more energetic, aggressive policy by the administration to try to simply up the ante and make it a more worthwhile deal.
Yeah, no, I just think too many in the House Republicans especially are on a very narrow track.
Okay, we'll open up the floor. Alan Wolf, please introduce yourself and say where you're from and then fire away.
Alan Wolf, Dewey and LaBeouf. The way Congress expresses itself really in a institutional fashion is Trade Promotion Authority, or Fast Track, as was once called. The way to forge a consensus that sticks to some degree would be the House current leadership, yourself and your colleagues and the administration, to sit down and craft new legislation. Right now, there are major negotiations underway that don't have that guidance and no implementation method out there when some results are achieved in either TPP or in Doha. Do you see the possibility of coming together and trying to craft a new model, a new consensus with those three parties?
Including Fast Track?
In the form of Fast Track.
I don't think Fast Track's the major problem, or the lack of it. I think the major problem is what I discussed. Look, some international agreements moved along in their discussions without Fast Track. And so I think the problem is not procedural, it's basically a substance. And I think what we need to do is I think the administration needs to continue its efforts with confidence. It made major revisions, or helped to bring about major revisions in Korea. It is working on some important revisions relating to Panama. It is beginning to discuss important revisions on Colombia. I think on TPP, they need to have much broader discussions with people in the Congress and more broadly. And as to Doha, it's extremely difficult. It isn't the lack of Fast Track that has held up Doha. I know at times Pascal Lamy has said some time ago that other nations were holding back because the administration did not have Doha. Have Fast Track. I think that's turned out to be incorrect. The problem, what's holding up Doha are substantive issues and major differences of opinion between some of the major nations, both in terms of the industrial sector, the agricultural sector, the failure to seriously address service issues. And as you know, Alan, I think there are some major issues regarding trade remedies, and those have barely been discussed. There are some people who would like to undo what was done in the Uruguay round as to anti-dumping. And those things were put aside. So I think the issue is not procedure, it's will, and I think it is a narrow view of what we should be doing regarding trade. The president has put forth an export strategy, right? A goal. If that's going to happen, there has to be a broader view, including what I said, for example, about TAA. You cannot convince the American people, in my judgment, to move ahead on expanded trade agreements when hundreds of thousands of people who are laid off because of trade will be out in the cold. 177,000 people benefited from the 2009 TAA amendments. Those are now expired. And people in the service industry and people in manufacturing, a lot of them, not covered by the original bill, are going to have no place to turn. And by the way, you now have in Michigan the effort to reduce unemployment weeks from 26 to 20. Talk about the lack of a broad vision. We have a job to do in terms of Doha, not only the narrow vision here, but the lack of convincing people that there is a concern about their lives, about the individual impact of what we do here in Washington.
Sandy, you've mentioned TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, now a couple of times and called for a broader vision on that too. That is the one new trade negotiation that this administration has launched. What would you counsel them by way of improving that? And do you think they should shoot for an agreement by this fall when the U.S. hosts the next APEC summit in Hawaii?
The answer is, like I think is to every trade agreement, get the substance right. Don't let the timeline determine substance. Look, I was at Singapore. I'll do this quickly. And we had discussed with the Vietnamese at another meeting the issue of worker rights, and there are some agricultural issues relating to Vietnam. The administration was hesitant, if I might say so, to say as we proceed with TPP that the inclusion of Vietnam and now Malaysia creates a different set of circumstances. Look, we have a trade agreement with most of the TPP participants, right? We already have an FTA. It's Vietnam and Malaysia that are new ingredients, and the administration should not be hesitant to say this means we have to bring up new issues and address them. So setting these targets, essentially, in my judgment, is a reflection of what I called the old model. It assumes that all you have to do is put together an agreement and bring about more trade regardless of the substance, regardless of the impact. And we can't do that, for example, in our relationship with Vietnam, because there are agricultural interests here that are going to be concerned about the substance of it. Vietnam remains quite a command economy, and unless changes I don't know of, the only union is a company union, i.e. the government union. There's no freedom for workers there. And we have to, I think, have a different model and say as to Vietnam, sure, let's get it done as soon as we can, as long as it's right.
Thea?
Thea Lee, AFL-CIO. Thank you so much for this speech, Sandy. I think that your concept of the need for a new globalization model is exactly right, and I agree with a lot of the elements. I guess I want to go back to the Doha Round for a minute, and how do we reconcile the problem here, which is that what's on the table in terms of the Doha Round really doesn't include a lot of the elements that you talked about, certainly workers' rights, currency manipulation, cross-border adjustment with respect to global climate change provisions, some of the tax differentials that we have between countries. These seem to me some of the most important things that a global multilateral trading system need to address. And I believe, we do need good, strong multilateral rules, and yet the conversation at the Doha Round, it's not just the problems with sectoral differences and some sectors liking and other sectors not, and some countries being ahead and other countries being behind. It's that we're not even talking about the right things. We don't have a new global model on the table for the Doha Round. How do we make progress given that?
I'm so glad we're doing this, because it helps to bring out what these issues are. I mean, that's very pertinent. I guess my reaction is, I think we're going to achieve a new model fully, major step by major step. And I think with the Doha Round, it was started in a way, it was kind of ethereal. People left there thinking we had achieved much. It was interesting, the Europeans went back and said the exact opposite what we said regarding agriculture. The exact opposite. All it was were kind of generalities. And I think we're going to have to do this step by step, major step by step. For example, worker rights, I left it out of my talk. Originally, when I wrote it, I referred to the effort of the Clinton administration to have a working group on worker rights. Remember that? That was Seattle. And there was such resistance to it. We've now come away. I don't think in this round we're going to be able to achieve all the steps. I think what we need to do in our country is to sit down and talk about what we want to achieve that is major progress in the Doha Round. So I agree with you that it's not enough simply to resolve the differences between Brazil and the US on industrial, or between China and India on agriculture. I think we need to press other issues, but it's going to be major step by step. But I think it's wise to make sure these issues are on the agenda.
Sandy, I find it interesting, and you and I have talked about this for many years, but from a philosophical standpoint, what you really want to do is expand globalization. You want it to cover a variety of issue areas which it's impinged upon, but then bring those, as you were saying, as Thea was saying, under the international rules of the game.
No, absolutely. I mean, as we expand trade to expand its benefits, look, you can critique, we're having a good discussions, China PNTR in terms of there was no worker rights that we inserted in. It was impossible, I think, for China's accession to include meaningful worker rights provisions. We did, though, when we set up the commission, the Congressional Executive Commission, we included rule of law, human rights, including worker rights. And there has been some serious attention, surely when I chaired it, to the issue of human rights and worker rights. With China, I think it will be step by step. I'm not in favor of simply letting the old model work and say, over time, workers will have their rights in China. I think we need to continue to press that. Do I think we could have a full-scale worker rights provisions in the Doha Round? I don't think so. But that doesn't mean we don't continue to pursue it. and press that issue as effectively as we can. My own judgment is if we would talk more about this, we might even reach more agreement if everybody did not choose up sides before we started. And that's what's happened on trade issues. It's one of the most polarized of all issues. And as you know, I deeply dislike it. So you know my feeling about worker rights. I've expressed them. I deeply believe in them. I think we have to have a plan and how, as you put it, globalization expands to include all these. I think someday worker rights will be part of the international trade regimen across the board. I think environmental issues will be part of the international structure across the board. I think other issues like that will become part. I think someday currency will be part of an international structure. Someday, I hope while you're still heading this, currency, we will have restructured international financial structures. So currency, I'm in favor to somewhat expand on this. You mentioned currency. I would be in favor of the administration filing a WTO case on currency.
Against China.
Against China. I know those articles have never been used for this, but on issues like currency, worker rights, environmental issues, these other issues, we need to push it and not accept the old notion that things will work out in the wash, because when it comes to currency, it comes to worker rights, come to environmental issues, and a lot of others, if we're not in the vanguard, it will never happen.
Jetta?
I'm Jutta Hennig from Inside US Trade. Mr. Levin, I have two quick follow-ups on 2 points you made. One was you called on the administration to act confidently on trade and submit Korea implementing bill. Is that, in your view, even without the consent of the Republican leadership or without having reached an accommodation with the Republican leadership?
I'll take that. That's the first question. The answer to that question is yes. The administration should consult with the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House. If the House wants a markup to do so, it should then send the implementation legislation to the Congress, and in time for Korea to be implemented, passed before Memorial Day.
But what would happen then if the Republican leadership pulled the fast track, just like Pelosi pulled the fast track of Colombia? Wouldn't that defeat your stated purpose of not having American companies lose out on the Korea FTA?
No, because first of all, I would hope American companies would tell the administration and others, not only the business community, but others, that Korea should proceed. It should not be held hostage. We're holding too many things hostage in this town.
Okay, my second my comment on that is good luck. I think the Republican leadership has been leaning on the companies pretty heavily. But my
well,
second...
the Farm Bureau said, others have said they want to proceed. My guess is if the administration does that, it will happen. I don't think, look, with Colombia, it was the substance of the agreement, of the Colombia agreement. With Korea, it has nothing to do with the substance of the Korean agreement. And I think the administration should be confident and proceed. In my judgment, it's an agreement with a major breakthrough. I've expressed that.
And my second follow-up to a point you made on the Santos-Obama administration talks on Colombia. Are you satisfied that the administration's demands are sufficiently broad to address the problems you have identified in Colombia?
We'll see.
Is that a yes
I mean,
or no?
there's discussion back and forth. We'll see. I mean, I deeply believe it's important You know, Colombia has the 6th or 7th worst income differential in the world. I think workers being empowered is important for that country and for us, for our labor movement, and for our business community.
Chris.
Thanks very much, Fred. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Mr. Chairman, thank you for a very comprehensive speech. If I could ask a clarification on Fred's very first question. If I understood you correctly, you're saying that on labor with Colombia, getting the Santos administration to pass the appropriate legislation is itself sufficient, in your mind, for Colombia FDA to come forward. The reason I'm asking if that's correct is because in your speech and some of your other remarks, you've indicated that performance is also actual implementation. That could open up weeks, months, years before it could be accurately measured. So did I hear you correctly in your answer to Fred that if this new administration will pass the legislation and the administrative reforms that you feel are necessary, that is sufficient to meet your needs for Colombia to come forward now?
Now, for example, in the area of impunity, they need to take some administrative steps. The prosecutor's office, the Attorney General's office, needs to be strengthened and made much more efficient. But also they need to act on some key cases.
So we're talking a period of time.
No, they can act. I think they can act. They can take concrete steps that would make it very clear that when it comes to impunity, it not only will be different, but it is different. And I'm not saying that the administration is handling this. I'm glad they are. Unlike Peru, we negotiated, Mr. Rango, our staff and I, when USTR refused to do it, we negotiated with the Peruvian government. With Panama, I began to negotiate with the Panamanian government on these issues at their embassy. And then they elected a speaker, someone for whom there was an arrest warrant out. That stopped it. So the USTR and the administration are doing the negotiating. But I made clear in the speech, and I believe this, that they have to change their laws and they have to take steps relating to impunity, relating to violence, that gives confidence that it has changed.
So is it possible to put some kind of time frame where you sense I need to see things by certain dates? Or are we talking all year or maybe next year? I'm still not quite sure what this means in terms of chances for Colombia coming up at some point.
I think it depends on what the Colombians do. And I think the sooner the better.
Yeah, I think, Sandy, this is a fair as well as very pertinent question, because obviously one could string this out forever. You're not going to get, I'm sure, 100% resolution of what you and others are asking for. So then the question becomes, how much progress suffices? 75% of the cases, 80% of the cases, and I don't ask you to quantify that, but the administration, I guess, has said that it would like to get this done this year, and they're pursuing those objectives. I think they share them largely with you. Is that a goal you share, to try to get it done this year?
I think the administration said this year, and that the timetable is contingent on resolving the outstanding issues. And I think it's unwise for us, with the two countries, with the new administration in Colombia, setting out exactly what has to be in there. But I think the thrust of it is very clear. Look, take the if I might say a word, the associated so-called cooperatives. They're nothing but shells. that employers set up. They're nothing but shells to make sure there is not a direct employment relationship between the employer and the worker. And therefore, under Colombian law, the workers have, don't have their basic international rights. They tried to change that law after Santos came into power, and it was stymied and very much changed in the legislative process. So it would not go into effect until mid-2013, and it does not appear that even then there would be any basic change. They need to change their law because there are many, many more people now working in associated cooperatives than directly employed with their rights. That's what's happened. That's what's happened. And it's important for Colombia to change it. In terms of impunity, there are some concrete steps, Chris, that can be taken. I don't think, we're not dictating. We're trying to sit down and work this out collaboratively. I worked on this for 3-4 years on these issues. Now USTR is engaged, and they need to do it right. The emphasis has to be right, but not stringing it out.
Howard?
Howard Schneider with
Oh,
Washington.
so this is a different Howard.
Sorry.
We'll get you next.
You're the second, Howard.
We'll get you next. Stay up there.
Thank you. Congressman, I know
Which
that,
Howard are you?
Okay, I'm Howard Rosen with the Institute and the Trade Adjustment Assistance Coalition. Congressman, I know about your love for baseball, so I assure you that this is not a softball question. I do mean this.
I was known for my elbows on the basketball court. So.
As you may remember, several years ago, I had the honor of testifying before you on unemployment insurance. And unemployment rate at that time was about 4%. And there was somebody on the panel who actually said that with an unemployment rate like this, we should actually cancel unemployment insurance. And you had a very impassioned response. So here we are now with 9% unemployment, 9 and 10% unemployment, higher in some states. States like yours are having to cut back on unemployment insurance because of financial issues. Congress allows trade adjustment assistance to expire, affecting, as you note, 200,000 workers. Every worker counts. Why isn't there a bigger public outcry, given the fact that unemployment is so high and we are dismantling the protections for those workers? Is it because unemployment is seen as a state issue, trade is a national issue? Given your experience, why do you think it's so hard to get people interested in this?
Okay, quickly. First of all, the states don't have to reduce their unemployment insurance. In Michigan, the issue was, and this isn't about unemployment, so I'll be very brief, changing one word from 2 years to 3 years look back for 100% federally funded extended benefits. And it was hijacked to reduce Michigan, the first state, from 26 to 20 weeks permanently. I mention that because I think there's an attitude that spills over into other things. As to TAA, I think part of the problem is that people no longer go to offices to pick up their checks. It's hard to find the people. It can be done. But years ago, when we in the recession, I went with a reporter. We went to an office. He wrote up 6 people. They were on the front page of USA Today. But I think the reaction is coming. States don't have to do that.
Rob?
Hi, Rob Liberator with the German Marshall Fund. Rob Liberator with the German Marshall Fund. Sandy, you didn't, in your list of things that need to be addressed going forward in a comprehensive look at trade policy, you didn't mention investment. And when we look back at the China accession to the WTO, there was a big debate between Europe and USTR about whether or not investment should be part of it. For whatever reason, Charlene didn't want to make it part of it. And now you have major industries in China where you cannot hold a majority interest. And most of in India, Brazil, places that American industry capital might like to go, you're frequently encouraged to have a partner. The partner then supplies the parts, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any prospect in your mind for some advance in the investment front?
Well, there are two different issues relating to investment. I think that issue should be injected into Doha. If it isn't clear, and it may not be clear, that it's a violation of China's WTO obligations or any other nation, that should be clarified. I thought you meant there's another investment issue that some of us have talked about. And by the way, you maybe saw the recent article about investment and the claim that it was Ecuador, that the investment procedures are handicapping them in terms of following through with their procedures. I think we need to look at that area of investment because it relates to TPP. We need to try to talk it through. It's a complicated issue. But what you meant by investment, it should become part of the Doha Round.
Question back there. Yep. Why don't you go to the microphone? What happened to the other Howard?
Right here.
Howard, you're next.
Get up there next.
Ed Verona, U.S.-Russia Business Council. Congressman, you said that you would not support lifting of Jackson-Vanik or granting of PNTR until several conditions were met. But Vice President Biden was in Moscow 3 weeks ago, and he said it is administration policy to get Russia into the WTO, and that he himself would lead administration efforts to get Jackson-Vanik lifted without any conditions, that the conditions have been satisfied. If Congress doesn't lift Jackson-Vanik and PNTR, it doesn't prevent Russia from getting into the WTO if the administration carries through with the negotiations to the conclusion of an agreement. What it does do is it affects American business who will not be able to enjoy the benefits of Russia's entry into the WTO. Are you saying, in effect, that you will use your influence with the administration to get them to slow the negotiations down so that Russia does not get into the WTO until Congress is ready to lift Jackson-Vanik and grant PNTR?
Okay, now I'm glad you asked it because maybe it wasn't clear. I'm in favor of waiving Jackson-Vanik separately from granting PNTR. We can do that, I think, technically. But the administration hasn't wanted us to do that, nor has Russia. So I'm in favor of waiving Jackson-Vanik relating to refugees. That I'm in favor of, separately from PNTR.
Sandy, just to be clear, because that's a pretty important distinction. When you say waive, I mean, the administrations for 30 years have waived the application of Jackson-Vanik to Russia and others every year. But the issue is whether Russia then has permanent, assured access to the U.S. market as part of its WTO accession. Now, I thought I heard you say before, take Jackson-Vanik and or take Russia explicitly out of the previous trade legislation that...
No, you can take Jackson-Vanik off the table.
You mean repeal it?
Yes. Jackson-Vanik.
So you would repeal Jackson-Vanik, but not
grant PNTR.
Via PNTR legislation.
You can do that, but the Russian government rejected that. My brother's been working on that and others, and we haven't been able to convince people to do it that way. Now, as to the Russia, as to PNTR, I'm in favor of working with Russia to resolve the outstanding issues. I think Russia may not be interested in acceding to the WTO without waiver of PNTR by the U.S. And so when the Vice President said he wanted Russia to be in the WTO, I also want them to be, but under the right conditions. We have to resolve the outstanding issues. And I mentioned them. So we need to do it right.
Okay, Howard.
Hi, thank you all. Two things. One,
Please identify.
I'm sorry, Howard Schneider, Howard number 2 with the Washington Post. Is the Obama administration in accord with the extent of the changes and some of the details that you mentioned that you want Colombia to make in their law and practice? Have you consulted on this, and how close are they to what you envision happening down there? And secondly, what happens to Korea, do you think, if this just sort of languishes and continues to be held hostage? Is it just a matter of time and opportunity lost, or do you think at some point the Koreans are at risk of the Koreans saying, well, we're sitting here again for another year and bye-bye?
Well, on the first, as to Colombia, I think the administration is very well aware of what I recited. I have sent them all of the facts, and they know them. I don't think they refute them. As to Korea, I'm in favor of the administration breaking the deadlock, period. I think it can do it. I think it should do it. I think the White House should give the Republicans in the House ample time to be consulted, and then after that, send the implementation bill, which is ready or about ready, to the House. As you know, there are timetables within Fast Track.
Howard, on your second question, I might just add, I happen to have met with the president of Korea a little over a year ago, preparing for their G20 chairmanship last year and all that. And we talked about the Korea-U.S. agreement. And he said already at that time, the ink has been dry on this agreement for over 3 years, and I'm worried that my consensus here at home might erode and upset the apple cart. And that's not something we should ignore. They obviously want the agreement, but they've got domestic politics too, and so we can't ignore that. That reinforces Sandy's desire to get it done as soon as possible.
No, and also remember, that, as I mentioned, the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement goes into effect July 1. That's another reason, I think, for the administration to act in confidence and send the Korea document for consultation purposes and proceed.
Ernie.
Ernie Prieg, Manufacturers Alliance. Question is about manufacturing sector, which after all is 80% of our merchandise exports. And it has to do with TPP and Vietnam again. Last 5 years in particular, we've had a very lopsided, rapidly growing trade deficit with Vietnam manufacturers, largely as a result of Chinese investors in labor-intensive industry into Vietnam for export here, whereas U.S. manufacturers to export to Vietnam or invest there, they're up against one of the countries graded among the very highest in terms of corruption related to trade regulations, which the Chinese are very experienced in dealing with, but we're not, because it's been illegal for over 30 years for American companies. So my question is, how are you going to deal with this major problem of corruption in terms of trade, particularly in the manufacturing, investment manufacturing sector, in the TPP, in bringing Vietnam into the agreement?
The answer is I'm not sure, sir, but I think it illustrates the need to not be on automatic pilot. See, my complaint is too much of trade in previous years was on automatic pilot. I can remember USTR coming to us, Ways and Means, with charts showing all of our exports, but no chart on the imports here, which created a huge imbalance. And I would say, why don't you have charts on imports? We were kind of on automatic pilot. The notion is the more trade, whatever its content, it's better and it will work out even if there are immense problems and it's very one-sided. What you say is a vivid example of how we need to get beneath the surface of these issues. The answer is, I'm not sure. But we should acknowledge it's a problem and not just kind of merrily go along without mentioning those problems. It's a mistake. We have to be confident and serve notice. The fact we acknowledge there are problems doesn't mean we don't want expanded trade. That's a grave misconception.
Claude, maybe this will be the next to last one. We got
Two
one
more.
more. We got one more in the back.
And the cheap seat's way in the back.
Right.
I think you got some food, though. Yeah?
Got a middle seat here in the middle.
It's close to the food.
Claude Barfield, AEI. Where does the May 10th agreement stand in relation to your new model? Is that part of the new model?
Sure.
Is that where you think we should be?
Well,
Neither more or less than that?
No, I think it's a basis. It's a foundation. Claude, I think it's a foundation. It was a major breakthrough. And I don't mean to say that there don't need to be some elaboration of it. I don't think it settled every issue. But it was a major, major, major breakthrough. It now somewhat taken for granted, though there remains resistance. We put into a trade agreement for the first time enforceable provisions on worker rights and environment. For the first time, enforceable, like everything else. And so some of the criticism, for example, we did make a change in investment. I'm not saying that there aren't some outstanding issues on investment, but to hold up agreements because it doesn't solve every problem, I think, is not correct.
Okay, final question.
Sure. Eric Martin, Bloomberg News. The president, with the Chamber of Commerce and in the State of the Union address, said that he's interested in streamlining the way that U.S. trade is promoted and negotiated. Are you happy with the way that U.S. trade promotion agencies have functioned in terms of USTR and Export-Import Bank, other agencies? Should that be restructured? Is one question. The second question is that the president, during his campaign, had spoken about reopening NAFTA, and is that something that is that an opportunity that was missed or should be investigated, considering the majority of our trade takes place with Mexico and Canada?
Let's take the first one. I think we should always strive for more efficient structure. On balance, I'm not in favor of USTR becoming part of the Commerce Department. We have had too little intelligent discussion of trade, not too much. I deeply believe that. I think we've had an old model on automatic pilot, and we've been working to try to open up the debate about trade policy. And I think to simply have commerce embrace USTR, I've had some major disagreements with USTR, and I made clear where I was on Korea, where I was on Colombia, where I was on Panama, where I have been with this administration on TPP. I said to them at Singapore, say straight out that Vietnam makes this a different agreement. And they didn't do that, and so I did it as one person. But I think what we need to do is to maintain USTR as a unit that reports to the president and to the Congress. Remember, I mean, I could recite the Constitution, as all past chairs of the Ways and Means Committee have done, about the House role, so I'll now say that. On NAFTA, I think essentially what has happened since NAFTA, as I said in my speech, and I know it's somewhat controverted, I think that we have taken some steps that went beyond where NAFTA was. NAFTA had worker rights totally unenforceable. It was simply kind of a throwaway. And we had urged the next president to do something that was enforceable. So I think the discussion within the campaign was kind of an effort to, I shouldn't frame what the now president says, but an effort to express dissatisfaction with the status quo. Since then, I think some steps have been taken, and I am hopeful that with the discussion of Panama and Colombia, that we will take a step that takes the essence of Peru, the breakthrough there, and makes them real and doesn't go backwards.
Sandy, you were certainly provocative. You were certainly thoughtful. We appreciate your joining us again, being so candid, sharing so much time with us. We wish you the best of luck in getting these problems resolved and the trade policy agenda moving forward. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.